Hello, good evening and welcome to In Focus. I'm Nadim Majid. Our topic of discussion this week is going to be the power and energy sector. Is Sri Lanka headed for an energy crisis? Why? What fate has befallen the long-term generation plan approved by the Public Utilities Commission of Sri Lanka? To discuss this and more, we're joined by Mr. Damitha Kumarasinghe, the Director General of the Public Utilities Commission. Thank you very much, Mr. Kumarasinghe, for coming on the show this week. Let me start by asking you. Now, the Ceylon Electricity Board submitted a long-term generation plan, which features in the plans for new power plant projects and basically prepares the mix of fossil fuels and renewables, etc. That's going to supply the country's energy demands over the long term. We're talking 20-30 years, I believe. Now, this plan was submitted to the PUCSL. The PUCSL held a series of consultations with the public and its stakeholders, and then finally an approved plan was given back to the CEB. But now we're hearing of the CEB or a specific union within the CEB challenging the plan approved by the regulator and embarking on union action in the form of a work to rule campaign under the theme No Cooperation with the Public Utilities Commission. What's going on?
Actually, I want to explain the process of approving the long-term generation expansion plan. There's legal background to it. So the Commission can only approve the least cost long-term generation expansion plan. So it should be least cost, number one. Number two, Commission has to consult the stakeholders who are affected by Commission decisions under the Act. So Commission has consulted all the stakeholders who will be affected by the decision taken by the Commission. So Commission has approved this long-term generation expansion plan considering the least cost as well as the views of the stakeholders. And as per the Sri Lanka Electricity Act, that would be the approved long-term generation expansion plan, and it is the duty of the transmission license holder, which is Ceylon Electricity Board, to implement the plan.
There is a problem that immediately comes to mind here. Now, the series of consultations that you have had is basically it's with the public, the stakeholders, the primary stakeholders when it comes to the energy demand and the supply of the country is the public, the citizens of Sri Lanka. Isn't this why this is not a sort of a labor dispute? Why are we seeing the demands of a union, one union, trumping the views of the public, government policy, and the orders of the regulator?
So there's nothing has happened. So what we are saying is that the generation plan is approved, and we need power for the next 20 years. The demand is growing 5 to 6% every year. So we have to add the plants in the plan quickly, according to the plan. The moment you delay anything, it will end up either we have to supply power through expensive sources like emergency power,
private sector power projects,
or we may not be able to supply power. So the primary thing here is to implement the plan and supply power at the least cost. So it will help the economy, the people, the country as a whole to move forward.
Now, one of the major arguments that has been put forward by opponents to the PUCSL approved long-term generation plan is that there isn't enough space given for coal power plants, and that there is a need for coal to sort of cover the base load that is required to the base load of supply that is required to ensure that there is a uninterrupted power supply for the entire country. Is there any merit to this argument?
Actually, as I said, to provide uninterrupted power supply, you need power plants. Number two, to be least cost, you need the least cost power plants. So the generation plan is prepared as per Biz1st generation expansion plan and approved. And also there's one other very important element, that is the Commission should take into account the government policy also in determining the generation mix, the source mix. So at the time of approval, the policy was also no coal. So that's why it's according to the policy, it is the least cost, and it has gone through a comprehensive consultation process. So I think it's very clear plan.
Mr. Kumarasinghe, a few months back, if I'm not mistaken, the Public Utilities Commission of Sri Lanka released a report calculating the losses that the country is incurring for each month, each day that new power plants are not being commissioned. What is the current situation in terms of commissioning new power plants?
Actually, the 300 megawatt natural gas power plant is already tendered and awarded, I think. So the first natural gas power plant is coming up, and the government is implementing 3 natural gas power plants with India, Japan and China for 1400 megawatts from 2021 onwards. And also Ceylon Electricity Board has recently tendered 90 megawatts of solar power plants, which are in the plan, of course. So the plan is being implemented already, and the renewable power being tendered, natural gas already tendered, and the 3 government to government projects from 2021 are moving forward. So the plan is being implemented. I don't see any issue in that.
On that note, we're going for a short commercial break. When we come back, we'll be discussing these new power plant projects and whether they will meet the energy demands of this country. Welcome back to In Focus. We're discussing crisis or a possible crisis in the power and energy sector with the Director General of the Public Utilities Commission of Sri Lanka, Mr. Damitha Kumarasinghe. Mr. Kumarasinghe, when we left off, we were talking about new power plant projects that are in the pipeline. You mentioned 3 liquefied natural gas or LNG power plants that have been commissioned, with one with the government of India.
Not commissioned, but
that are in the works with India, China and Japan. You mentioned 2021. Does that mean that these power plants will come online onto the national grid in 2021?
Yeah, from 2021 onwards, this will come into the grid.
So this a total of 1,400
megawatts, and already a 300 megawatt is awarded. So those things are moving.
What's the current supply that we have at any given time? You said that 1,400 megawatts being
added.
What's the current generation capacity?
Yeah,
sorry,
we have already 4,000 megawatts of installed capacity, and our peak demand at night is around 2,400 range.
So we have a surplus of about
we have a surplus of capacity, but during the dry seasons sometimes the energy may not be barely sufficient. So it is due to weather conditions. Otherwise we can supply 20%.
There was a time in Sri Lanka when we were able to meet almost all of our energy demand through hydropower. Is that no longer feasible? Is hydropower no longer a feasible option?
No, actually most of the big hydropower potentials have already been harnessed, and earlier from until about 1995 almost all the power plants were hydro, but the demand has now is growing up, and the hydro resources are no longer there at that scale. So we have to diversify into fossil fuels. But another positive aspect is that the renewable energy prices like solar and wind are coming down dramatically. So with those trends and the technology developments over the past so many years, getting power through renewables is a very cheap and feasible option, and that's why in the generation plan also decision, Commission has directed Ceylon Electricity Board to consider increasing the renewable share from current 40 to 60 by 2030.
We've seen allegations. Now there were a lot of allegations of misappropriation and misconduct in the procurement of coal for the North power plant. Now we also have heard allegations of misappropriation or misconduct, improper tender procedures, etc. With the Kerolapitiya LNG plant, or a combined cycle power plant. What is the situation now with LNG plants? Have these allegations been responded to?
Actually, we are not involved in the procurement process. Commission stops at the approval stage of the generation plan, and the procurement of generation plants and commissioning, so on and so forth, is with the Ceylon Electricity Board. And as far as I am aware, the first natural gas plant is almost in the verge of award, and there are a few more tenders came up on solar.
See, this is very interesting. Now you say the regulatory field, or your sphere of what you can regulate by the PUCSL, is already very limited in scope. You said it's basically the approvals process. You approve the long-term generation expansion plan, and after that it's the CB's job to implement it, and they're in charge of the procurement and etc., etc. Still, even with such limited regulation and oversight, you're facing a lot of opposition to what little regulation there is. Is this a normal situation?
No, actually regulatory mechanisms, regulations, regulatory institutions are a well-developed concept, and regulators are there in all the countries, and the electricity sector is regulated everywhere. So does telecom and other sectors. We have Telecom Regulatory Commission, Public Utilities Commission, then we have
the Securities
and Exchange Commission, Central Bank, so many regulators. So everybody performs the regulatory function. So regulated entities should act according to the legal requirements and the regulatory decisions.
Do you feel that your scope is limited? Do you think that the Public Utilities Commission requires more regulatory powers, or do you feel that the current framework is sufficient?
I feel the current framework is sufficient. Now what I am saying is that the implementation is done by the regulated entity or the business entity. So that part is not the regulator's job. Regulator's job is to set the rules, set the standards, set the regulations, the procedures, and ensure the transparency for the customers, as well as the fairness, to ensure the fairness, because you have consumers, you have a utility monopoly, so there should be some party to ensure fairness in this trade. So that's the role the Public Utilities Commission or any other regulator plays. So we are very
this is a very interesting point that you bring up, because this specific engineers union that we're talking about within the CEB that is embarking on this work to rule campaign has said that they will not be responsible for any disruptions to power supply during their work to rule campaign. Now one could argue that this is very unfair by the consumers, the public of Sri Lanka. What power, if any, does anyone, or the PUCSL or anyone else for that matter, have to ensure that people are held responsible, that people working for the government, taking salaries from the government, are doing their jobs?
No, actually Ceylon Electricity Board is responsible because under the license, they are operating under the license, transmission license. Transmission licensee is responsible for continuous power supply. So the Ceylon Electricity Board is responsible for maintaining a continuous power supply.
If they don't, what action can be taken?
Then the Act provides that we can issue, the regulator can issue the orders to implement that, and failing which the next option under that is to go to the courts.
On that note, we're going for a short commercial break. When we come back, the final segment of our discussion with the Director General of the Public Utilities Commission of Sri Lanka on the possible crisis, or preventing the crisis rather, if you wish, in the power and energy sector in Sri Lanka. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the program. We're discussing the power and energy sector. The CEB, the Ceylon Electricity Board, and the PUCSL, the Public Utilities Commission of Sri Lanka, at loggerheads once again. Mr. Kumarasinghe is the Director General of the PUCSL. Thank you very much for being on our show this evening. Let me ask you, over the past several days, there were rumors of discussions between CEB engineers and government officials, political authorities. Was the Public Utilities Commission represented in any of these discussions?
We are not aware of that, and we have not represented it.
Do you think it's strange that in a discussion involving the regulation of the CEB, that the regulated entity is there and the political authority is also there, but the regulator is not represented? Is that strange?
No, actually, this is not I think I'm not aware of the discussions, but from what you have said, it's not between the regulated entity and the regulator. The regulated entity is the license holder. This is not with the license holder. No, it's a part of some union or some part of the license holder. So
your position is that it's not the CEB that is having discussions with the minister, it is one part of the CEB that is...
No, what I'm saying is, I'm not aware about the discussion since you have mentioned that.
Okay. I'll not lay any traps for you, Mr. Kumarasinghe. Let's move on. Let's talk about the environmental impact of the long-term generation expansion plan. There have been numerous complaints by communities living in and around the highly controversial Norachole power plant, which is well known among the public for being the broken down power plant that breaks at the drop of a hat, that breaks down at the drop of a hat. There have been complaints with fly ash, the coal dust. That has caused numerous health complications and has had a very detrimental impact on the environment around there, according to environmentalists and people living in those areas. In the midst of all of this, we see one group within the CEB continuing to argue the case of coal power, of coal-fired power. Why?
I'm not sure.
When the PUCSL granted approval from the long-term generation for the current long-term generation expansion plan, which, as you pointed out, is being implemented, there are new power plants that are being commissioned. Did you take into consideration environmental degradation that is caused by coal power?
No, actually, we have considered, and we have to consider, because when it says least cost, it's the least economic cost. It's not only the least financial cost. So we have taken all these into consideration. And number two is that for environmental issues, there are ways of mitigating those environmental issues, and any power source has
environmental impact. Even solar power has an environmental
impact. So we have to work to minimize the impact to the environment.
On that note, There have been allegations of non-compliance at the North Surrey power plant, non-compliance with environmental regulations, which has caused, regarding the storage of the waste product, the fly ash and coal dust, which has been largely responsible for a lot of the environmental complications that we're seeing in that area. What steps, if any, can the PUCSL take with regard to ensuring that compliance?
Actually, Ceylon Electricity Board, Public Utilities Commission, the Central, Western Province Provincial Environmental Authority, Northwestern Provincial Environment Authority, all have got together and agreed on certain plan to mitigate the environmental impact. And now the Ceylon Electricity Board is in the process of implementing that, where all these issues are covered in that agreement. And I think it will take some time, but I hope this agreement would be implemented, and we can come into the legal framework of environmental.
Let's talk also a little bit about the economic cost of delays in establishing new power plants, in commissioning new power plants. The PUCSL, correct me if I'm wrong, but the figure was somewhere around 30 billion rupees or 3 billion rupees per week, or
should be planned.
3 billion rupees per
month, probably.
Per month. Okay. Now, is that still a concern for the Public Utilities Commission? Or has that concern now been addressed?
No, that is a concern, but with the new power plants coming in, we can mitigate that those issues. But the issue is, the moment you delay a plant, as I said earlier in the generation plan, then we will have a void there. So we have to have some form of power to feed to the grid. So if you take it from other sources, it will never be the least cost plan, because you are delaying the least cost plan. So that will have a cost.
Mr. Kumar Singh, thank you very much for coming on Biz1st in Focus. It's been a pleasure having you on the program. A few thoughts for the people to think about, for you, the public, the consumer, in this puzzle between the regulator, the Public Utilities Commission, the regulated entity, the Ceylon Electricity Board, and of course the political authorities of this country. The government has a policy, has made a policy decision to move away from fossil fuels, to embrace renewable energy sources, to ensure the energy security of the country for centuries into the future, for decades into the future, let's say. Maybe they don't have long-term visions expanding into centuries, but the current long-term generation expansion plan has been approved following consultation with all these different stakeholders. The primary stakeholder, of course, being you, the public. In Sri Lanka, the people are sovereign. When a single entity seeks to jeopardize a plan, a policy that has been approved by consultation with the sovereign, the people, what does that amount to? Something for the public to think about. Good night and good luck.